Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Wednesday, April 9th, 2025 at 2 in the afternoon. So now we are going to start taking a look at S-127, but just the TIF provisions that are within the bill, or the TIF-ish provisions. So we have our legislative counsel, John Gray, with us to walk us through that. John, welcome. We don't see much of you these days, but it's always good to have you in here.
Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I will screen share. Look at that. So clear. Beautiful. Tax increment financing. That's what we're talking about today. And in particular, we're talking about within S-127, the Community and Housing Infrastructure Program, which you may have heard referenced as CHIP, and which emerged from the Let's Build Homes proposal. This is a project-based approach to tax increment financing, and I think that I've spoken to you guys as part of joint hearings before, so I don't know how much level of detail to provide. When I've been doing this, I've generally tried to educate as to differences between TIF districts and this program as I walk through it, and I'll kind of talk about basics, and I can do that if that's what you would like.
Very good.
It'd be helpful to have the reminder.
Yes. So just generally, when we think about tax increment financing, what we're talking about is defining a particular geographic area and then freezing the value of that property at a time, and then saying that as its property goes up in value over time, we pick up the incremental revenues that are generated by that growth in property value. So basically, if your property was valued at $10,000 and then 5 years later it's 15,000, the tax on that 5,000 additional property value that was generated would be your incremental revenue. So the reason that matters for tax increment financing is you're taking that incremental revenue that would otherwise go to the Ed Fund for the statewide education property tax, and you are applying that to particular financing. So generally what we're talking about is applying that to improvements in TIF districts. This is infrastructural development, with the idea that it will stimulate other kinds of growth. And the economic theory behind this is that you will actually end up generating greater property value than would have existed in the absence of the development. And therefore, over time, you're actually creating additional revenues to the Ed Fund. It's just that for a particular period, you're paused on those incremental revenues going to the Ed Fund. So that's really the high-level approach of how TIF works in this state. The way that we do it is we have the Vermont Economic Progress Council, VEPC, approves the use of tax increment financing. And so generally, a municipality is creating a geographic area, a big district in which projects could occur. And then they're having VEPC approve through their application process particular uses of tax increment financing. With a project-based approach, what is distinctive is the area in which you have freezed the property value in the area that matters. So for this particular proposal, we're not talking about a broad TIF district in which a bunch of projects might occur. We're talking about pursuing infrastructural development. That's the improvement, with the idea of stimulating housing development. That's the theory that's here. And so the site that's chosen in this draft you'll see is called the Housing Development Site. And it is a constrained site, unlike a TIF district, which can be quite large. This is the site on which that housing development is constructed, plus any immediately adjoining parcels. And that site, that geographic area, would be where you freeze the property value for purposes of TIF, and you generate that incremental revenue. So with that, I will jump into the actual text itself.
Seek a little clarification. So the area is just the site of the project, or does it include those neighboring places that will be directly affected by the infrastructure?
It just is the parcel on which the housing development and not necessarily the infrastructure. It's just the site on which the housing development occurs, plus any immediately adjoining parcel. So it could pick up immediate neighbors, but nothing beyond that, basically.
Right. Just
It's unlike the TIF district, which could be a broad area.
I got it.
Yep.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep.
Appreciate
it. So what I'll do is I will talk about the text, and when something is just exactly or extremely similar to the way TIF districts work on the books now, I'll probably just say that and skip past it unless it seems like essential for understanding. And I will pull out when something is distinctive to this approach. So on page 25, this is your definitions section for this new proposed subchapter for this. And I should say too, for existing TIF districts, you have to look to two titles. You have to look at Title 24, which is how municipalities are defining their geographic areas and incurring indebtedness and the like. And then Title 32, which is where we deal with the education property tax, deals with BEPC's approval in the application process for purposes of ease of reference and how infuriating it is to try to understand TIFs by looking at the books. I put everything just in one subchapter, so this is a one-stop shop. That's the idea behind this. So we're talking definitions in this proposed subchapter. Brownfield is a concept that's used in TIF districts, so I'm not going to spend much time over that. And I think something people are familiar with. Same for committed. This is just a technical term that's used in TIF districts that's meant to get at if you've locked funds for infrastructure. But subdivision 3, developer, this is a new concept for this project-based approach CHIP. So when we talk about TIF districts, what we're talking about is a municipality goes out to bond, they take on the financing for the infrastructure project, and then they hope, I mean, presumably they're thinking about these things and they're organizing with other folks, but the hope is that it will stimulate particular development. And you could be agnostic as to what that development is, right? You just want the property values to increase. It doesn't necessarily matter what the actual development occurs is, at least theoretically. In this proposal, you are tying a particular infrastructural project to a particular housing development, and you're going to have a contractual relationship between the municipality and the developer that is making that housing development, and potentially a third-party sponsor, but we'll come to that later. So developer, intuitive concept, the person undertaking to construct a housing development, and they would be governed under this housing infrastructure agreement, which we'll come to later in the bill. Subdivision 4 is the definition of financing. This is the actual money that you're putting toward a project. And this is the same thing that's used for TIF districts, or big TIFs is the way you may hear me reference them throughout this, just to contrast with project-based TIF. And in this case, it's your debt, principal, interest, any fees incurred by a sponsor, we'll come to that concept, or other instruments or borrowing to pay for that housing infrastructure project. And I do want to call this out as distinctive. I was mentioning that the site is where the housing development occurs. That does not have to be contiguous with, doesn't have to be the same site as where the infrastructure occurs. And what you're actually financing as the muni, you could be using a sponsor for this, is just the infrastructure. You're not financing the housing development. It's governed by this agreement, but what you're financing is just like in TIF districts, you're financing the infrastructural improvements. And so that's what you see here in the definition of financing, is it's what is used to pay for a housing infrastructure project authorized by a municipality.
So make sure I really understand that distinction you're making. So as an example, if the wastewater treatment plant needs an expansion to accommodate the housing development, there's an example of
Exactly.
that split.
Exactly. And that's why you might want geographic separation between the two sites. Is if it had to be the same site, you might only get particular kinds of infrastructure. Subdivision 5, definition of housing development. Again, hopefully this is just an intuitive concept, but it's unique to this proposal. The construction of one or more buildings that includes housing. We'll come to the BEPC application later, the actual process that you have to do to get approval for tax increment financing. But I do just want to call out that this includes housing is quite loose, right? It's just a building that has housing. So technically, and I'll talk about this when we get to the project criterion, technically there's no square footage or like minimum square footage or unit minimum requirement. It's just you got to construct something that includes housing. But when we come to the actual application, I'll draw that out more. The housing development site, we've talked about this. This is the parcel or parcels that encompass that development, and it's going to be where it's constructed, plus immediately adjoining, and you'll see that further detail in section 1908 when we get to it. It's subdivision 7, the housing infrastructure agreement. Again, we're going to have a whole section on this, but this is the agreement, the legally binding agreement to finance and develop that housing infrastructure project and to construct a housing development. I just want to keep reminding people, think like big TIF, you're pursuing infrastructure with the idea that housing development will occur. And so the financing is for the infrastructure. But to ensure that the housing development does occur, there is this agreement. That's what this housing infrastructure agreement is. It governs the financing of the infrastructure. It covers the relationship between the muni and the developer. And if applicable, a third-party sponsor. Should I pause here?
How does that work? Because above we're saying has to be a building that includes housing. And then here we're saying how the contract is going to be just for housing.
The contract is going to govern all of the parties, so the sponsor, the developer, and the municipality, and we'll come to the section on this. I will say the section is relatively bare bones. It just tries to identify what's in place, but this is meant to ensure that whatever kind of financing the municipality is undertaking, there's a relationship between the muni and whoever that might be. And then whatever housing development is meant to occur would be governed by this too. So there would be a relationship between the developer of the project, of the housing development, and the municipality. They would both be under this agreement.
But I guess what I'm getting at is it only for the housing development piece?
No, so the financing would be for the infrastructure.
So it doesn't matter if you have a building that has retail on the first floor and housing on the next 4 floors.
Right, exactly.
Or just to verify, this captures mixed use.
Yes, and we'll come to that. I think of that as distinct from the agreement itself. The way that mixed use was used in Senate economic development, I think, was unfortunately often misleading because people would contrast mixed use with housing. Mixed use accommodates housing, and so in this case, if you include the sole requirement for getting in the door for a development is that it include housing. It could literally be that one unit is housing and everything else is something else.
So the only way that you can access this type of TIF is that it has to have a housing component to it.
Exactly. That's right. And we'll come to the application itself, but that's right. Page 26, housing infrastructure project. This is the infrastructure that you're pursuing. When you see the word improvements, that's what we're talking about. So one or more improvements authorized by the municipality. The housing infrastructure project is just the infrastructure piece. And I realize some of the wording feels sort of odd because you have these conceptually distinct things, but hopefully once people have had time to sit with it, it will make more sense. Again, munis are pursuing infrastructure. They're trying to stimulate the development of housing.
Not to be.
Yes.
Does approved, authorized, does authorized
Mhm.
mean something specific?
We will.
Does it matter?
So what you will see is when we come to 1908, for big TIF districts, there is a whole process that you go through in part because you're bonding, right? Because you're bonding and folks are going out for a public vote on bonds. They're providing information to the voters. And there's a whole process that the legislative body of the muni, so that's the city council, mayor, whoever it might be, that has to create this process, has to go through the application process with BEPC, and has to authorize the creation of a geographic area. And then whatever improvements are pursued within a TIF district, they would have that bonding component that would result in a public vote. What it means here for authorization is that the legislative body will have had to create these pieces. And then I would just caution, we'll come to the sponsor piece. But you may not always have a public vote as part of this proposal because the public vote is triggered by bonding. So if the municipality is not the entity financing the projects, there wouldn't be that public vote, but there would still be authorization for the project through that creation of the geographic area and listing with the lister and assessor and the like. So there is an affirmative step that is required, but you are correct to identify that it might mean something a little different than for big TIF districts, depending on the financing that occurs. In any case, the provisions are such that the public would be made aware of the same kinds of information that you would receive for an improvement within a TIF district in this case. It's just that public vote attaches to bonding, and because the muni may rely on the financing of the developer rather than the municipality, you may not have that public vote component, but we'll come to that too.
Just one. Give a little breaking news that I just saw on presidents. Has paused the tariffs for all trading partners except for China for 90 days.
We get our mark back.
Maybe we take credit for it.
Yeah.
He got our message.
For China.
Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt.
It's very flattering to be speaking to such a powerful. Thank you for listening to me. Clearly, small fish. So, improvements, which is your infrastructure. This is a concept that is used for TIP districts, and I will draw the ways in which this is distinct. This is the same structure with slight tweaks to what is in place for TIP districts. So improvements you can think of as consisting of two pieces. There's one, the intuitive piece, which is the infrastructure itself, right? That's what you're trying to finance. So under subdivision A, you see the installation or construction of infrastructure that will serve a public good. This is maybe not going to make a ton of sense without a lot of other context, but the traditional language that's used for that is to serve a public purpose. And typically, the way that this has been thought about, at least in the discussions that I've heard, is that this would result in infrastructure being a public infrastructure. The reason that this was opted to switch to public good for this proposal is to say, well, the public good here is housing that's being provided. So the proposal is not trying to force that infrastructure to be public. It could be that you have, for instance, a parking garage that serves the development, and that could satisfy potentially this public good criterion. So I just want to call that out. So infrastructure that serves a public good and fulfills the purpose of this subchapter. We'll come to that piece shortly. But just to call it, the purpose of the subchapter is to stimulate the development of primary residences for folks of low to moderate income. So you have those purpose constraints to the infrastructure itself. And then we have a list of inclusive or indicative items. I will just call out whenever you see an including list, it doesn't have to exhaustively define the thing, right? It's just telling you these are instances of the concept that I'm trying to communicate to you. So in this case, the concept is infrastructure. And here's the list of things that are being called out as, yes, we say that these are infrastructure. It doesn't mean that you can't have other things. So utilities, that's for TIP districts. Digital infrastructure, this is something that is unique to this approach, but I just want to say digital infrastructure theoretically could fit under TIP districts too. It's just that folks haven't done it. Transportation, that's under big TIPs. Public recreation, this is distinctive to this approach here. It's not listed for TIP districts. I think what this is trying to get at is things like trails. But in any case, any of these examples would need to be infrastructure. You can't just include an item here, say that it's infrastructure, and then suddenly it's permissible. This is an example of a kind of infrastructure. So public recreation is one of the kinds of infrastructure. Parking. Parking is again distinctive to this as against TIP districts. The reason this is called out, because if you see the next item, it's public facilities and amenities. Public facilities and amenities could include parking, right? But it would only include public such ones. So if you were trying to do a private parking lot for a particular housing development, that's why you see this call out to parking here. Land and property acquisition and demolition, brownfield remediation, site preparation, all of those are things that exist for TIP districts. But the last line here, this is distinctive to this approach, flood remediation and mitigation. And I will say I can't always speak to what people anticipate to happen under these categories, but I would just call out any of it has to be infrastructure. So that's your classic things you think about as improvements. But there's a second piece to what improvements are that will be unintuitive, but relate to what the program is trying to do. The funding of debt service interest payments for a period of up to 4 years, beginning on the date on which debt is first incurred. This is a technical provision. This is not unique to this. This is done for TIP districts, but on a different time frame. It's done for 2 years rather than 4 years. Basically, what this tries to solve is the problem that happens if you've pursued a project, but the increment that is generated is insufficient to cover the costs of your financing in the first years because there hasn't been a rise in property value. So what this does is basically say, as part of your financing, because the reason that the definition of improvements matters at all is that financing is applied to improvements. What basically this functionally results in is you can finance your early year payments. That's the result of this. And by tweaking the years that you make available under the subdivision 4, you modify the years in which you can essentially finance your early interest and principal payments. For TIP districts, that's a 2-year period. Here, the justification that I heard for why to have a longer period is that your site is smaller. And so the increment generated could be quite small in those first years. So extending the clock for funding of debt service interest payments. But of course, what this means is that you have to account for those costs in your financing. You're basically taking out financing to cover your early financing costs. Legislative bond.
So those first years where you actually prepare the site and install the needed infrastructure, you still are going to see an incremental increase of that property's value, right?
Right, we might naturally expect, I mean, we're guessing, but we might naturally expect both from improvement and from natural appreciation that there's a rise in property value. But I did want to note that it could be distinct geographically from the housing development. So conceivably, I don't know, but conceivably you could be pursuing the infrastructure project at the same time that the housing development is occurring, right? So, and the housing development site is where the increment is generated. So it's the growth that happens there that matters. And yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So you could have some appreciation during that period, but it is worth noting.
But it's gotta be on private property, right? So if you're running a sewer line down the street, you're not gonna see. Well, yeah, I guess you.
But what you're-
Because you're preparing it for that site,
Yeah.
right? So the site itself, because you have availability of whatever you need to put in.
I guess what I want to be clear about though is that the housing infrastructure, the infrastructure that is being financed, unless it is on the housing development site, it doesn't matter if you have appreciation on the infrastructure site. The only place you're looking for growth is the housing development site. So only if the infrastructure is occurring on that. And to your point, it could be that the infrastructure increases the value of the housing. I mean, theoretically, that's the whole idea behind it, right? Is that's why you can pursue the project is because you're installing this infrastructure. So hopefully it is.
And what's in place to understand what the property value increases every year?
So there's the standard provisions that apply for TIF district, and we'll come to those sections. But there's a certification required each year of the new assessed value on that site and the determination of
So
the
the
gap.
municipality has to get it assessed?
I may wait until we get to those sections, but yes, it's the same way as it works for TIF districts, which is each year they have to evaluate that gap. And then that's also subject to audit, just to confirm. Yep. Legislative body, same concept as exists for TIF districts. So this is your mayor, alder board, city council, select board, president, trustees of an incorporated village as appropriate. Muni, same piece.
Municipality doesn't include fire district or any other, or does it?
I honestly don't know what falls into the buckets of city, town, or incorporated village. I can look that up, or I can jump to that, do you want to pull up Title 24? This is, I will just say this is the same language as is used for TIF districts, so it's picking up the same kinds of municipalities. But if that's a broader bucket that you want expanded.
No, I'm just wondering if it includes that broad bucket.
Yeah, this is just as broad as what is in place for TIF districts. Original taxable value, we've talked about this piece. This is the total valuation that's determined for all real property located within the housing development site as of its creation date. I'm going to talk about creation date matter because it matters for these purposes. When you set the OTV, tells you what kind of increment you're generating. So when you freeze that, value matters, but we'll come to that later. And then a technical provision at the line, which is, can't remember the agency that requests this, but this is consistent with TIF districts just to ensure that that site is not divided or bisected for purposes of setting OTV. It's not that you couldn't have parcels cut. It's that when they determine OTV, I think it creates all kinds of calculation values if they have to do calculation errors or issues. But again, this is consistent with Big TIF. It's not something unique to this proposal. So this is what they're accustomed to doing for OTV. Related costs, this is just like TIF districts. This is expenses incurred and paid by the muni exclusive to the actual construction and financing that are related to pursuing the project. So when they're setting things up and the like, you might incur costs trying to set up the project. And it includes reimbursement of sums previously advanced. Again, just like TIF districts, so this is not something I think need to spend a terrible amount of time on. But this next piece, subdivision 14, this is one of the, I would call it as one of the biggest novel features of this proposal as against TIF districts. So this word sponsor, this, I mentioned before that for TIF districts, the only entity that is contemplated to receive increment and to finance the infrastructure and receive an increment against that is the municipality. In any instance in which a municipality is trying to avail itself under TIF districts of tax increment financing, it's going to bond. It's going to take on its own financing to pursue a project. The concept of sponsor here is to allow for different folks to take on the financing. So not just the muni, it can be the muni, but it could also be, so this is the person undertaking to finance a housing infrastructure project. And again, it's just the infrastructure, not the housing development. Any of the municipality, a developer, or an independent agency that meets state lending standards may serve as a sponsor for a housing infrastructure project. So basically what this means is one of three entities can finance the project, and that entity will be the one who will receive the increment to cover the costs of the financing. So this is quite unique to this proposal as against TIF districts, because the TIF districts only contemplate municipal.
Is that unique around the country?
I don't think so. I will say that I don't know a lot about how other states operate their TIF districts, and part of why I have refrained from learning more, aside from time constraint, is TIF means something very different in states outside of this because we're linked to the ed fund. But the concept of providing tax increment to a developer is not novel to this approach. It's just novel within Vermont. Yeah, I think that is, yeah. Section 1907, this is just setting out the purpose, much like there's a purpose for TIF districts. And this, you'll recall, flows into the definition of improvements. It applies a kind of purpose constraint. So the purpose of this subchapter is to provide revenues for improvements and related costs to encourage the development of primary residences for households of low and moderate income.
I know we passed it, but the sponsor,
Mhm.
so that could technically be tax stabilization. With that as tax stabilization, right?
Can you say more, or maybe I will
So-
reveal that I don't know much about tax stabilization?
So I know when we have the ability to do tax stabilization in Barry through charter, and we set the value.
Mhm.
And then the person that owns the property does not pay above that value. Or it incrementally increases over up to 10 years. So if the sponsor is the property owner, they could be getting,
Yeah,
could
so
be like a tax stabilization.
So just based on the way you've described it there, and thank you. I think what you're getting at is that the economic impact for the owner of the property could be the same as they would receive under tax stabilization, but I think functionally the mechanics are different, right? The tax is paid, it's siphoned into an account and then returned to folks that have sponsored it. But it could be that the economic outcome is the same for that developer. Yeah. But accomplished by a different means, because you're still taxed on the full value of the thing. It's just that it's an increment, yeah. And it comes
And
back.
it's something to think about is because it's more administrative work for the municipality
So,
to do it that way versus allowing the municipality to
Mhm.
cap it. And that's all they collect for taxes.
so I think this is a really great point, and perhaps where I should have started my testimony entirely, which is that anytime you look at these proposals, I think it's easy to get caught up in the words in front of you and the fact that we're talking about TIP today, and that's what is the live proposal. But generally, what you're thinking about is like, what problem are you trying to solve? And this is just one tool in a toolkit to solve that. You may have easier, less administratively burdensome ways of achieving or resolving the same problem. And when you think about at the large level, once you've thought about the policy, whether you're just trying to solve a particular problem, you should evaluate this against other pieces. But just to say why you might want it, it would be one more tool in the toolkit, but you could, of course, pursue different ways of achieving the same, and tax stabilization might be one. I will jump to page 28. So we're getting to the actual process, and I tried to organize the chapter in a sort of, or the subchapter in a sort of intuitive way. So a Muni could look at this to see like, how do I start up the process? What is each step? And so the first piece is just creating the project, the infrastructure project and the housing development site. And I will say I do something sort of funny or cute here, which is all that you really need to do as the Muni, at least from like a putting words on the book piece, is you don't create a project because a project isn't real until you've received financing. You need to have plans for the project, and that's what this section sets out. But what you're really doing is defining a geographic area. That's the only thing that will have really emerged at the end of this section. You'll have a plan. So I don't mean to say that functionally there aren't useful other parts of this. But when we say creation of a project, nothing's happening yet. I just want to make that clear. The creation of the project is just a plan. But the creation of the housing development site is the definition of the geographic area. And why that matters is for freezing that value and creating the increment. So what does a municipality do? The legislative body may create within its jurisdiction a housing infrastructure project. It's really what I was referencing when I said there's like cute or funny wording. It's creating a plan really, which shall consist of improvements that stimulate the development of housing. So it's infrastructure, stimulating housing, and a housing development site, which shall consist of the parcel or parcels on which that housing development is installed or constructed, and any immediately contiguous parcels. So what they're really doing is creating that site and coming up with a plan. To do this, a municipality in coordination with stakeholders shall develop a housing development plan, which includes a description of the infrastructure project, the proposed housing development, and the proposed site. Identification of a sponsor, so who is financing the infrastructure? Again, it's just the infrastructure that's being financed by the sponsor. The sponsor could be financing more pieces, but that's not what's governed by this piece, and the other financing would not be eligible for the tax increment financing. The housing development plan would additionally include a tax increment financing plan meeting standards, the same standards we apply for TIP districts, and we'll come to that subsection, but it's things like costs. And some of it is duplicative of what you'll see here, but it's ensuring that you have kind of a BEPC approved tax increment financing plan. Projection of expected costs, projection of the increment to be generated. So what kind of revenues can you expect for financing to be made available if the project works out? On page 29, a development schedule, including a list, cost estimate, and schedule for the proposed infrastructure project and that development. In subdivision 2, you're outside of the housing development plan. So that's kind of like laying out what project you're trying to pursue and what housing development you're trying to stimulate. Subsection 2 is a map, really. Develop a plan describing the housing development site by its boundaries and property therein, entitled Proposed Housing Development Site, listing municipal name. This is just like what's done to create a TIP district. You have to create a plan that describes it and all the property within it. Subdivision 3, hold one or more public hearings after public notice on the proposed housing infrastructure project, including those plans. So this means that there would be public hearings, and you would see, the members of that municipality would see the proposed plan for the infrastructure project, the plan site, the housing development itself, the expected cost, expected increment that's meant to be generated, all of those things. But note, it's just adopt by act of the legislative body. So just the legislative body, that's city, council, alder board, mayor, select board, whatever it might be. Adopt by act of the legislative body, the plan developed under Division 2. So that's creating the geographic area. That's what I was trying to get at. This section is creating that map, basically, and that's recorded with the municipal clerk and lister assessor.
Just gonna ask, there's nothing in there that says modification of the plan or anything like that. Is that something that perhaps might be, modified as necessary based on? Or is once the plan is set in step 1 or 2, whatever step it was, we need to be thinking about that, or is this rulemaking? And
So I was going to say, we'll come to a section later where BEPC is authorized to undertake rulemaking for this program. But I will call out that, I'm trying to remember the exact technical term, but for big TIF districts, we contemplate that you can submit kind of like a major modification, like, we've changed TAC here, and so we want to update the plan. This doesn't include provisions like that. You could do something like that through rulemaking. But I would say part of why I didn't, when I was drafting this, include something along those lines is, unlike TIF districts, where you're setting out a big map, right? And conceivably a bunch of things could happen in it. In this case, you're pursuing a defined project that you're pursuing. So the thinking, at least to me, was that you have a greater sense of what you're doing here and getting approved. And you might have, you know, different projects going on, but they would be different applications, right? So I think the answer is rulemaking is the simple answer to your question, but I do think of them as maybe conceptually distinct from TIF districts where you might have greater certainty as to what your actual plan is here and less of a need to update, although things may happen along the way.
I'm trying to understand what the purpose of the public hearing is.
Oh, just to let, yeah,
Is it sharing of information or is it gaining information? And if it's sharing of
it's sharing. It's sharing of information.
Okay. Okay, then I wonder if public hearing. I would just, okay, I'll put a pin in it.
Public information session.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I know where you're going is that through that public hearing process, if information comes or thoughts come from the public on maybe doing something differently that works for the developer. Sure. Right?
Yeah, okay. So I think I'm better understanding the question. At this point, I want to say nothing has happened. You haven't started the application process, and what matters is the plan that you submit as part of the application process. So there's nothing about this that would prohibit you from altering the plans in light of the public hearing, basically. You would need to provide notice of those plans as updated under this, but there's nothing to say that you couldn't revise the plans that in light of the information you gave. Does that make sense? Because what matters is the plans that you submit as part of the application, and at this point, no application has been submitted.
So this is just a plan for the application.
Yes, and there's two pieces to call it. There's the housing development plan, which is what I'm thinking of as being enlightened by a conversation with the public, and then the development site, which is a map, basically. And as you'll see, the legislative body has to adopt by act that plan, which would be recorded with the municipal clerk and Western system.
3 and 4 can be, but don't have to be on the same day.
Oh, they don't have to be on this. Yeah, I wouldn't expect them to be on the same day, actually, but yeah. If the legislative body cares about the members of the municipality, I would expect them not to be on the same day. Lastly,
I think people can care about municipality.
Yeah.
However, I see your
Yes.
point.
No, sorry, I didn't mean it. I meant it in like a
Been rushed.
it would be natural. It would be natural for them not to coincide, is I guess my point. The instance in which I would expect them to coincide is someone not taking sufficient care of the members of their unit. Yes, I talked about creation earlier and why this matters for purposes of OTV, original taxable value. The creation of a housing development site shall occur April 1 in the calendar year in which VEPC approves the use of tax increment financing for that housing infrastructure project. This is distinctive as against TIF districts. For TIF districts, the creation occurs the calendar year, April 1 of the calendar year in which the municipality approves that plan. So whenever they define the TIF district, that's when the actual creation occurs. And what creation triggers is a couple of things. But as we talked about before, one of them is fixing at the original taxable value. So when you create this site matters. It affects what the OTV is going to be. It affects some other pieces as well, which we'll come to later related to debt incursion clocks and retention periods and the like. So that will matter too, but I just want to call it that's distinctive against TIF districts where creation occurs upon municipal approval of the plan. Here it's upon VEPC approval of the tax increment financing for that housing infrastructure project.
And at that point, they have done an assessment of the development site.
At that point, they have gone through the whole application process. So all the plans that you've submitted, they have signed off on those pieces and said, you meet the project criteria and you meet the location criteria, you satisfy the purpose of the subchapter and the like. And just to call out why this has become a question for folks, you could have that your municipal approval occurs in 2026, but you don't get VEPC approval until 2027. And so it could affect when you get that start of the clock.
Well, and I think then your site value, right? Where you're freezing your property value. can change from time,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So
That's,
what you-
that's,
But what you want is the actual value at the time that Betsy gives you permission.
yes. I mean, it depends on what you guys want, but, it is a choice. It has meaningful effects, and one of them is what the OTV will be, which will affect the size of the increment that's generated. So there are actually some kind of competing incentives. There's some advantages to having OTV set earlier because you generate a larger increment. However, if it starts the clock earlier, it limits the period in which you can actually incur debt. And so if you think about a municipality trying to go out and finance pieces and they don't even get their Betsy approval until the year later, they thought they had a 5-year period, but effectively they have a 4-year. So there's multiple concerns that go into it. Section 1909, this is your housing infrastructure agreement. So this is what's governing the housing infrastructure project. And we have just a kind of few guidelines for what this has to set out, but you could enhance this or create additional protections or the like. Has to clearly identify the sponsor for the housing infrastructure project. So who is financing the infrastructure? Clearly identify the developer and the housing development for that site. Subdivision 3, obligate the tax increments, the retained tax increments for not more than the financing and related costs for the infrastructure project. What this means is the increment is only going to financing costs for infrastructure. You're not applying that toward the housing development or any other pieces. It's just going to financing and related costs for the infrastructure. And provide for performance assurances to reasonably secure the obligations of all parties under the housing infrastructure agreement. This is kind of a safeguarding provision. I will say that this was something included on the last day. I had a more generic, like protect the municipality type language, just as a suggestion. It doesn't do a lot, but basically the agreement should have some kind of things to safeguard the parties to the agreement. And what I would call it here is this says performances assurances to reasonably secure all of the parties. So it's protecting each of the parties to this agreement, the developer, the muni, and the sponsor. And the municipality under subsection B shall provide notice of the terms of the agreement for the project to the legal voters of the municipality and provide the same information, and we'll come to that 1910A. But again, kind of trying to provide public notice provisions. Section 1910 is kind of the heart of this program. This is the actual application that's undertaken by a municipality availing itself of the CHIP program. And this sets out what they need to do, what they need to provide to VEPC, and what VEPC needs to review. So subsection A municipality upon approval of its legislative body may apply to VEPC to use tax increment financing for a housing infrastructure project. The VEPC may approve only applications that meet the process requirements, the project criterion, and any of the location criteria, which we will come to shortly. And what you see on the last line of this page, and the application has to be submitted on or before the end of 2035. Effectively, this is like a sunsetting of the program you would check in, but it leaves the program on the books so that VEPC could rely on that text as projects would still be ongoing even after the application cutoff, right? Theoretically, they could be ongoing for many, many years after that. So this is kind of a sunsetting. It's saying get your applications in before the end of 2035, 10-year period, basically.
Ashley, if there's anything you want to weigh in on, just let me know.
Thank you.
And maybe
Appreciate it.
questions that you might have, depending on what we say too.
Awesome. Thank you.
Subsection C, these are your process requirements, and these are fairly straightforward to meet. I would say if you've gone through the process of creating that infrastructure project in your plan, your housing development site. These are mirrored on the existing TIP district process requirements, were a little bit slimmed down, and that's generally what you're going to see throughout the draft is slimmed down requirements to make this administratively easier is the thinking. So VEPC shall review a municipality's housing infrastructure project application to determine whether the muni has created that housing infrastructure project and housing development site. So have they gone through the 1908 process? Have they come up with the plans and given to the voters, and have they assigned and listed with the lister or assessor that housing development site? Have they executed a housing infrastructure agreement for the housing infrastructure project that adheres to the standards of that section that we just walked through with the developer, and if there's a third-party sponsor, including the sponsor as well? And have they approved or pledged to use incremental municipal tax revenues for the housing infrastructure project in the proportion provided elsewhere in the subchapter? The way I've been describing this is a sort of the reason we have VEPC review at all as you'll know on the books, we have entirely municipal tax increment financing contemplated. It's not a statewide rate from which you're pulling revenues, right? It's not a statewide tax. You're just pulling from municipal revenues. So if you were exclusively going the municipal tax increment financing route, you don't need a Pepsi application for those pieces. And so what this is calling out is that you're going to have your statewide property tax, but you're also going to have your municipal tax revenues. And we just want to make sure that you're taking as much effort with your municipal tax revenues as you take with your statewide property tax revenues. In this case, you'll see that the actual percentage required is 100% usage of municipal tax increment revenues for financing. So the entirety of your incremental revenues for the municipal property tax would be devoted to financing for this project. Subsection D is your project criterion. So this is when we were talking before about what housing development is, like what has to be included in that housing development. We're thinking about the project criterion. And in this case, it's for TIF districts, we have something like 3 of 5 and 2 of 3 for your project criteria plus your location criteria. Here it's dramatically simplified. There's just one project criterion. VEPC to review that the project application to determine whether the housing development includes housing. And again, it's just includes, doesn't specify minimum floor area, it doesn't specify minimum units, just that it's got to include housing.
So downtown, the municipality has a potential of building a huge complex and the top floor is gonna be housing. That everything else is gonna be retail and that's sufficient.
That satisfies the, yeah, you just got to include housing.
Thank you.
But is the incremental growth only applied?
No. The incremental growth is the entire increase in assessed value on the site. And it would include the adjoining parcels. So any growth that results in the surrounding parcels would be picked up in the increment generated.
So when you say surrounding parcels, it's got to be part of the initial, that TIF application. Like,
Exactly. It's anything within the housing development site. And I think maybe I spoke too loosely. The housing development site is where the construction occurs of the housing development plus immediately adjoining parcels. All of those would be the housing development site. I'm not saying that any further immediately contiguous parcels outside of the housing development site would be picked up. Only the housing development site is where increment is generated. And it just happens to be that the site is such that it's the parcel on which the construction occurs, plus the immediately contiguous ones.
I just have a related question. So just want to understand how, like, if you've got a parcel, let's say it's a 10-acre parcel, and the idea is to bring infrastructure to it, build housing, but you want to subdivide that into lots. Can that fit within this?
Yeah, I don't think there's any issue with that.
Right, so you could have 30, 10-acre lot, maybe, small lots. You could have 50 parcels that came from that initial parcel and that would still work.
And just to call out the housing development site, this may be something that's fleshed out more in rulemaking, but the housing development site can be parcels. I keep saying parcel, but it can be parcels. You can have multiple. You can define a housing development site to suit the construction of whatever you're trying to do.
Got it.
Was your question that the notion of contiguity doesn't diminish as
Well,
a parcel that was surrounded by things is then subdivided?
yeah, and all of a sudden you've got, right, you've got 50 different parcels versus one with the adjoining properties. Yeah, exactly.
So sorry, I just want to make sure I'm understanding this. So the sponsor is borrowing the money to build infrastructure. That's the only money that can be borrowed is for the infrastructure. And their part of this plan is that they will build at least one housing unit in addition to the infrastructure that they have said they're going to build.
That's close. The sponsor doesn't have to be the one building the housing development.
Correct, okay.
So the housing, basically, to put it in the most dramatic way possible, you could be a municipality who wants infrastructure. You create a housing infrastructure project, and then you create an agreement with a housing developer who is separately going to create a housing development. And you say, well, we want to do this, so we're going to apply the increment against the financing for the infrastructure. And then as long as you create a housing development over here on the site that you've defined, we're good. That is like the most dramatic way to put it. The idea is that the infrastructure facilitates the housing development. But yes, you can think of them as separate. Like you can almost think of them as conceptually separate, right? Like you're pursuing infrastructure as a municipality and then housing development is resulting. Does that make sense?
So we have no ties that say the infrastructure has to be for this new house.
The infrastructure does have to stimulate the development of housing. And so presumably it is the housing development that's being pursued. But
Okay.
if we're trying to put in the most dramatic terms.
Yeah. Thank you.
Is infrastructure defined?
Yeah, improvements. Oh, but you mean just the word infrastructure within improvements? It's not, which is the way that the word for differs too.
So would raising a house up, because it's improvements on housing, correct? It qualifies for improvement in housing or no?
So
You know where I'm gonna get.
I maybe don't know the full answer, but would know that the indicative list of improvements includes flood remediation and mitigation. So, but I don't think I'm the one to determine what constitutes infrastructure, so I can't definitively tell you what is. But it does, as listed, it contemplates flood remediation and mitigation, but it would be a question as to what constitutes infrastructure.
Might consider, maybe.
Maybe, yeah, I mean,
Could you speak up, Michael?
So one of the things that was in my bill was about fixing housing that is slated for destruction because of, whether it's a FEMA buyout or whatever.
Flood mitigation.
For flood mitigation, we have a lot of properties in Berry City that people don't want to live in because they keep getting flooded. And I was curious if this would cover a situation where you've got a property owner can't afford to spend $100,000 to raise up their house. So their options are get a FEMA buyout, money's off the tax roll, or what if the municipality can come in and say, we're going to lift your house up and lift them out. And it will automatically increase the value of the house because it's now out of a floodplain. And it allows a family to stay in their house. Sorry. Hey,
It's real.
we get a lot of people in Barry that have struggled with this. So I'm curious if this would do that.
I think it's a question is how folks would interpret infrastructure. It does, I've said as much as I can say to be responsive, which is that the explicit call out is to flood remediation and mitigation. But yeah,
Because to that, it feels like there is in page 8, there's the application requirements. The eligible projects shall demonstrate the project will create reserve capacity necessary for new housing unit development. And I'm just trying to find like how often do we specify new housing? How that interacts with what you're proposing or what you're discussing?
yeah.
It's not new.
So so that I think I can speak to, which is that the piece here does require construction of a building with housing. So if the sole, I thought what you were suggesting is that infrastructure and then also housing is stimulated, you get a win, you get two wins, right? You've done infrastructure, you've created housing here, and you've also stimulated the creation of new housing. If you weren't pursuing any other housing development outside of raising the site that is already a constructed building, I don't think that you satisfy alone that requirement because you haven't created new housing. Now, maybe there's a question as to, well, if it wasn't habitable before, did you then create something? And I think that's maybe.
Yeah, I would agree that it would, but I don't know if I don't want to mess with it too much, but it would be nice to have like that small minor adjustment would make a huge difference in our flood impacted communities.
We should make sure the
Okay.
language.
Well, I think explore it more. I think we need to understand that do you have housing that is in the floodplain that's, do you have several houses that could be encompassed in that?
Yeah.
So that, I don't think you want to go, one over here, one over there, one over
Right.
there. But if there are some that are contiguous, that you could work something out. And so I think it's something we should think about.
It would be nice if we could see language on that, and I would push back a little bit on you on the individual house, because it might be the only house in the area that is prone to flood, and I would not be,
If it's utilized tip, right?
I get it,
You know,
I get it. It's, well, I get it.
And part of it is the analysis would say whether or not it was economically feasible to be able to do
Right.
that,
Yeah.
right? So, but it does make sense to me if the purpose is housing, right? And if you're talking about houses that
That you're
are
gonna
either gonna go
lose.
away,
you're gonna
right?
lose them, right?
So,
So we'd have.
so
to-
yeah,
And just put out there that it might be worth also just in general talking about crafting a rehab bill for a lot of our houses.
it's like the VHIP program.
The V.
I guess we have the, no, whatever, but like, or adding to it or something.
I do want to call, I have to leave in like a minute.
Sorry.
So, no.
It might be a good place to stop.
Let me finish this section, I think, and then it'll be a natural place.
I want to get to one thing now. Want to make sure we're not creating, we're talking about creating housing, right? But we're not creating a situation where commercially this could be gained by putting one house on one piece of property and then creating commercial property the rest of the way.
You're correct to be thinking that way. I don't know. If that's fair to say. The criterion for getting in the door includes housing.
Okay, so we need to think about that. I think if our purpose, and like you talked about, we need to understand what our goal is. And if our goal is to create housing, then we have to make sure, and the other pieces are incidental. So if we create some retail, commercial, that's fine. But we have to make sure that the language is.
And if I could offer the reason that the Senate backed away from having particular minimum floor area or minimum unit type requirements was the concern that projects might not pencil out, and you had folks coming in and saying, for example, if you had a 30%, 40% minimum housing requirement, if we're doing mixed use, we're gonna meet 90%. Like we don't need to do this, but for the ones where it's threshold, would you then suddenly have gone through the application process and lost it? So that was there was a time at which, I just want to clarify, there was a time when there was a minimum gross floor area, 50% dedicated to housing proposal, and the Senate backed away from that, just to offer. Yeah.
And I don't know that we need that type of language, but in the intent, we may want to specify that we're looking, this is a housing bill. And it just, something that gives Betsy, when they're approving projects, that they look at that.
Yeah.
I don't want to hamstring anything, but I also want to make sure that this doesn't get gamed as well. And we think that we're getting these big housing projects and we wind up with, few houses and a whole bunch of commercial property, yeah, which, not a bad thing, but we need housing.
What,
Yeah, and-
commercial property, which makes me think today.
That's fine.
5 years.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think also within the bill, we have that first the municipality has to sign off on it, right? So it's gotta be in their best interest and see the financial benefit. And
And that may
then
be-
Pepsi signs off on it too.
So as long as, I think just, we want to make sure there's some stronger language that just puts that thought forward. John, you gotta go.
Yeah, I gotta go. Also just for context, I don't know, I'm out of office Friday, just so folks know.
Nina's gone Friday too. You're not going to Gloucester, are you? Or
I'm
Gloucester?
going to the Masters.
Oh, wow.
You got a nice coat to wear and. It's green, right? You should have seen him last year.
Have you been practicing your signs?
Borrow.
I can borrow
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Okay, John, thank you.
For sure, I'll be back to, yeah.
That's it for today. So we're back tomorrow again, room 11 at 9 o'clock. We're having discussions on tourism. And then back in here for 11:15, again, to try to finish it up with John. So, any questions? Thank you for your work today. I think our hearing this morning went well. Apparently, the president was
Results.
tuning in.
Figure out support for when it comes back in 90 days.
so